Hello, and welcome to this VoiceThread lecture of our Introduction to Research Methods. This is going to cover the chapter 1 of the Keytone text. So in addition to the resources that are posted to Blackboard or that are shared for our class, you can also find these extra resources that are associated with the textbook, and they're actually pretty high quality and useful. So if you go to the website for the book, www.mhhe.com/ketone4, it is the fourth edition, you'll find a chapter outline and summary for each chapter. There's also a quiz where you can test your knowledge, and these are useful tools to help you really lock in the course material and certainly to help prepare with exams, or if you want to come back to any of this material later as you're working in other classes on research projects, this can be a nice kind of summary so that you don't have to reread the entire chapter. The place to begin is to tackle this question of what research generally is. And we consider it the process of asking questions and finding answers. So a lot of it has to do with what kind of question is being asked, what sort of information is needed to answer that particular question. And those are the themes that we'll be covering together. Importantly, the crux of research is that it is the application of scientific and systematic procedures, and it assumes that patterns can be uncovered. So, when patterns of human behavior are discovered, social scientists, such as communication scholars, create useful theories of that communication that try to capture these patterns. And so we try to understand and perhaps predict people's behaviors, the motivations behind them, how we can understand them. And all of this isn't based on feelings or vague impressions. We're using empirical data, empirical evidence. And what that means is that it is based on observable phenomenon, that the data that we use in order to answer these questions is something that we can capture, that we can replicate, that we can point to. And that is especially important in today's cultural climate where fake news is now a thing. How do we know what we know? And as communication scholars, how can we say that the answers that we're providing to questions are good answers, that they're rooted in reality? And that is through observable data. And so the empiricist nature of research cannot be underscored enough. Now, your individual relationship with research is probably pretty varied. Of course, as a member of this class, as a student in this class, you have some academic and scholarly interests, but you might also have a professional connection to research. A lot of professions, academia, PR, advertising, marketing, politics, health, education, media, public policy, urban planning. I mean, the list goes on and on. They're all closely tied to this idea of empirical data and observable data and answering important questions. And you'll note that many of that list of professions that I just rattled off might not have research in their title, but it is a central part of professional duties. So in addition to how we use it in our personal and professional lives, we're also research consumers, and we want to be critical consumers. We can't accept information at face value. We have to know, what was your source? Where are we drawing these conclusions from? Um, think back to when Sean Spicer was the holding the first press conference as press secretary for the White House before he left, and it had him talking about inauguration attendance. And he made two claims that the park's services hadn't released the numbers, so there was no way of knowing how many people were there, and that the press was underreporting attendance. Also, that it was the most watched inauguration in person and on TV ever, as he said, period. So those two claims contradict each other. How can you say it was the most watched? Definitely. How do we know that if we weren't tracking viewership? How can you say it was the most highly attended in person of all time if we didn't count how many people were there, or if we did, that those numbers were not released? I mean, on face value, we know that that makes no sense, that perhaps those claims are accurate, but we have no way of confirming or denying them. So um, Kellyanne Conway went on to call those alternative facts. Well, we as consumers of data get to decide, do we think that that passes muster? Does it have credibility? Does it have the source content that we need to be able to trust and believe it? And a lot of that comes down to empirical data. Is it observable? Can we repeat it? What are some informal ways of knowing that we engage in? We might look around, observe, we might go off of others' behaviors. In persuasion, we would refer to that as the theory of social proof, looking around to see what other people are doing to understand, what is expected or what is correct. Research is essentially about making claims based on data. And different types of claims require different types of evidence. And therefore, it is a formal and systematic method where we keep careful record of what questions are being asked, what elements of those questions are important. Those become variables. We'll talk about that in chapter 3. And what kind of evidence we're using in order to answer the claim, where we got that information from, what it looks like, how it was collected, whom it was collected from, what other influences might be present. And so the gold standard for scholarly research is that it is public. It must go through review of experts before it becomes, say, a conference presentation or an article in a peer-reviewed academic journal. This nature of making something public and it having gatekeepers of experts before it becomes public acts as quality control. And of course, that is not a perfect system. Think about the medical studies that implied that vaccination was associated with autism. That data was ultimately shown to be falsified. The people who published that information basically lied about their data, and they didn't get caught in the peer review process. They got caught later when people tried to replicate their study, do exactly what they did, and find the same results, which didn't happen over and over again. Replication was impossible, and so ultimately um, suspicions were raised, and it was demonstrated that they had lied in the first place. And so it's not a perfect system, but typically those gatekeepers protect bad information from becoming public. And we know that scientific outcomes look to describe a different variety of outcomes. So some describe behavior, ways in which variables are related to each other. And of course, variables are just another name for the concepts that we study. Sometimes it's determining the causes of behavior. So, knowing motivations and outside factors that might matter help us to make suggestions for effective communication, for interventions, for best outcomes. If we can, we like to predict behavior. This, of course, is harder to do than explaining behavior. But if we can describe communication events and understand their causes, we can move towards predicting and being able to anticipate behaviors. And this helps us make better decisions. What products to sell, how to describe a public policy, what style of leadership will get the best results from this group of employees with this kind of task, etc. And of course, explaining behavior, understanding why behaviors occur in the way that they do, is an important line of inquiry as well. One of the major goals of conducting empirical research is to make some kind of theoretical contribution. So, to build towards a new theory or to further develop an existing theory, which is a set of concepts, definitions, and propositions that present a systematic view of some phenomena. It's basically a related set of ideas that explains how or why something happens. A theory provides a way of thinking about and seeing the world. And it is developed over time. It's tested and tested again. Other people start using the theory, make additions or changes as needed, point out exceptions, apply the theory to new contexts. Um, and it attempts to explain or predict phenomenon. So we always want to make a theoretical contribution, and all research should be theoretically driven or aid in the creation of theory. So theory can come in different places. Either we begin with a theory, and that shapes what kind of question we ask and what kind of data we collect and how we interpret answers, or theory comes in at the end where we don't start with one, but we're trying to build towards one. Maybe there isn't an explanation for certain communication phenomena yet, but we want to make one, and so the data is collected with the goal of doing that. But always, theory is going to be a central part of the process. Communication as a discipline is one of social science, and so when we say that, of course, communication scholars focus on messages. What messages are more or less impactful, memorable, efficient, offensive, etc., and under what conditions. But we're all looking for patterns of communication behavior through empirical design. So we are going to verify through observations or experiences. We're going to carefully track the entire process and go through it systematically, report that, and make it public. We are going to focus on quantitative methods in this class, which relies on numerical measurement, but equally rigorous and just a different kind of approach are qualitative methods where the researcher is the primary observer. The scientific approach is a systemic process. You always go through this similar steps in a similar order. And the research follows traditions and procedures. It looks like this. One, you have to begin with an interesting question. If you already know the answer, then it's not a good question. And so we know a lot of things, but there's much that we don't know. And so we begin with an interesting question. What don't we know? Why should we know it? How is it helpful? How is it useful? Two, we formulate a hypothesis or a research question. And so a research question is open ended. It says, is there a difference here, or is there a relationship here between these concepts, between these ideas? A hypothesis is a little more predictive. It says, I think that there is a relationship here, or I think that there is a difference here between these two things. So it would look at concepts that seem to be important in a certain situation. Three, it uses reason and experience to refine the hypothesis or research question. That might change the scope of the project. It might change the research agenda. You might need to be more specific about what kind of relationship you expect to see or what kind of difference you expect to see between your concepts or variables. And fourth, you conduct the observation or the measurement or the experiment. You do the data collection, whatever type of data you are going to collect, and you carefully, systematically record exactly what is done so that you can make that public. Five, you analyze and interpret the data. Now, there are a lot of different ways of analyzing the data. The data will inform how you need to analyze it. There's different kinds of data you can collect, and we'll talk about that together. But this is the next formal step, that once you have systemically, carefully, thoughtfully collected data, you need to derive some meaning from it, and that is the analysis interpretation step. The characteristics of science. One, that it is based on evidence. Empiricism is paramount. Experts can disagree, so you need observable, reportable, shareable evidence, evidence that can be replicated by someone else to test its validity. Two, if it can't be tested, you can't make claims. It must be testable. Three, that it explores all possibilities. So there are different ways of explaining one given phenomenon. Why do people ghost on potential romantic partners? Just drop off the face of the earth. No Dear John letter, no breakup text. They just stop communicating. Well, there's a lot of ways we could explain that. We probably all have hunches or likely explanations, and we might disagree about why people do that. In an effort to show that their proposition cannot be disproved or that there aren't better explanations than yours, you have to demonstrate that you have considered likely alternative possibilities. You have to back up like, this is the best explanation because I have considered all likely explanations, and this is the one that holds water. And let me show you why. Because of this data that I collected that is observable, I can point to the evidence for why this is the best. Four, that it is replicable. Repeating shows that the results are real and not by chance. There's that expression, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Well, we take that into account when we're collecting data too. You might expect to find a certain result from your data, and sometimes just by pure chance, that's just the way the cookie crumbles, you might get agreement. Yes, I found what I thought I would find, but that just might be by chance. And the way that we rule out the fact that this happened just by coincidence or chance is by replication. We repeat it. Can you collect the same type of data from the same type of person over and over and find the same type of result? If you can, then you can rule out the likelihood, at least, that it is by coincidence. Statistically speaking, you could, by coincidence, find the same thing over and over and over, but it's very unlikely. And then we have numerical records and tests to show the likelihood of what we're finding is real. 6, science is self-correcting. Methods are always improving because results are made public, and therefore those results can be tested and challenged. And so people are always getting better. The field of science is always getting stronger due to this public nature and the replicability of science. 7, measurement and observation. That's what this class is all about. Hooray. 8, that science recognizes error. And additionally, that science tries to control for error. We know that some error will occur. That's just the way, we're humans, we're not perfect, but we try hard to minimize it. And we have specific procedures that we follow in order to minimize error. And so error are biases and accidental findings where you think you found something, but it's just by chance, it's not really there. Or you think you didn't find something, but that was by chance, that there is a relationship, but you failed to find it. So that's what we refer to as error. And then we take many careful steps in order to make this possibility as small as we can. Number 9 minimizes bias and distortion. We try to be objective through empirical evidence, through rigorous methods. That also helps us, in addition to avoiding error, helps us to remove any personal influence or personal perception flaws. And 10, there is always an element of skepticism. We test every assumption. We don't rule anything out until we can test it or disprove it. And so we always assume that there is a chance that what we found was biased, or there is a chance that what we found was influenced by error. So we don't speak in absolutes. We will never say, I absolutely proved for a fact 100% that this is the relationship or this is the difference. We will just say that there is a strong possibility that this relationship exists, that this difference exists. We recognize that there's always a chance that someone could come along and find a better explanation or disprove what we have found. And so that's what we mean by skepticism. We recognize that nothing is set in stone, that there could always be a more sophisticated or different or better way of understanding. And that's a good thing. That increases the rigor of our methods. 11, generalizability. This is the extent to which the findings of one study apply to similar people in similar situations, not that didn't actually participate. And so when we say that we want results to be generalizable, it means I might collect survey data from 200 people going through a divorce. But ideally, if I collect my data in a rigorous and methodical way, that my results won't only apply to that 200 people, that it'll apply to all similar people going through a similar situation. And lastly, science is heuristic. And what this means is that heuristic takes in the whole. Research findings always lead to more questions. We collect data in order to answer good questions, but when we find answers to questions, that should likely lead to the next question. The ultimate goal of research is to lead to new findings and discoveries and to prompt the next missing piece of data that should be discovered. One important thing to note is that science is a series of tools that we follow certain methods in order to answer questions. And like all tools, a method is only useful if it helps answer the question or the hypothesis that you're asking. So the data has to actually address the query. And you know, I always think of the kind of metaphor like hammers are a tool, and hammers are great for hammering down nails, and screwdrivers are good for screwing in screws. No one tool can do all functions. And you might have one tool that's good for a lot of things, like Swiss Army knife with multiple different kind of uses, but there are still things that a Swiss Army knife isn't going to be able to accomplish for you. You're not going to cut a birthday cake with a Swiss Army knife. So you need to select the right tool for the specific job. Part of choosing the right tool for the job at hand is having a good question to begin with, because our questions will determine what kind of answers we're trying to find. And the type of answer indicates what type of data we need. And there are a lot of different kinds of questions that can be asked about communication phenomena. As an interpersonal scholar, of course, I'm really interested in how people relate to each other. And what makes relationships more and less successful, what kind of messages, under what conditions, what sort of privacy, what sort of individual differences, and there are all different areas of the discipline: political communication, health communication, intercultural communication, mass comm, and on and on. And so, generally speaking, we're all trying to ask good questions to develop or extend theory, to gain new knowledge. And we consider a few things. The general social importance. Is this going to have an impact on anyone? Does this help people in their lives? Does it affect people? The general social importance of it. Do we have personal interest? What kind of questions do you think we need an answer to? If you don't believe that an answer is important, then it's probably not going to be rigorous, methodical data collection, right? You have to be excited about it personally. And of course, theoretical significance. Like, what does this tell us? Is this generalizable? Does this help us understand larger things any better? ultimately it's the so what. How can the findings be used? Is the answer to the question useful? And also what questions need to be answered next for us to, live effective, successful, happy lives. There are different kinds of questions that can be asked. Questions of fact, questions of variable relations. So remember, variables are just concepts that we're interested in. So we want to know, are these things connected? And we're going to talk about cause and effect a little later, but it's the idea of, let's say individual differences or attachment theory. If we know people generally are securely attached or they're anxiously attached. If they're anxiously attached, they're either preoccupied or dismissive. And so we might want to know, is being different on this, being secure versus preoccupied versus dismissive, does that make you more or less likely to do X? So we could say, is your attachment style related to ghosting? Break how you break up with people. Maybe dismissives are the most likely to ghost and secures are the least likely to ghost. And then we can say, hey, there seems to be a relationship between attachment style and breakup methods. In addition, we can have a hypothesis about which attachment style will have what relationship, or that there's a difference between being those things. There are questions of value. And so this is usually like subjective evaluations of normative behavior, aesthetics. So, how good, how right, how appropriate a given communication practices or value or attitude is, and questions of policy, which ultimately recommend courses of action that are institutionalized through, health policy, through law. So the scope of the question can be quite large or quite small, quite personal or quite public. But ultimately, we want to ask good questions that tell us what sort of data we need to answer the question, and data that gives us results that help extend our understanding.